Hello and welcome everyone. This is the second lecture on Kant, and today we are going to discuss his views on morality or the source of morality that would guide individual practical actions or activities. So, in Kant you have a kind of combination of morality with individual freedom and autonomy. And as we have discussed in the previous lecture, that he considered human being capable of reasoning and rationality, and it is only through reason and rationality that individual can become enlightened and overall enlightenment can be brought about in the society or in the community. So, in the previous lecture we have discussed his views on enlightenment, the use of reason and rationality as the source of valid knowledge that would ultimately bring about enlightenment within the self and also in the community. Today we will see how Kant combines this reason and rationality as the source of human action or as the source of human knowledge to a kind of moral duty or a sense of morality that he combines with individual free will and autonomy, and thereby individual lead a more harmonious or happy life, which is a kind of permanent, which is a kind of continuous, and there is no contradictions or there is no enviness or violence in human interrelationships. So, overall Kantian objective of combining the morality with freedom and autonomy is to create a society which would be a kind of peaceful society, which would be a kind of republican society where every individual will treat other as an end in themselves. So, these are some of the things which we will discuss in the next lecture or the concluding lecture on Kant, while discussing his ideas on kingdom of ends or perpetual peace, and then we will discuss in the second part of that lecture critical assessment of Kantian thought. So, today we will begin with his views on morality, ethics, why we should be moral, or what is it to consider human being as a moral agent, and then what should be the basis of such moral laws or moral codes that would guide individual action. Before doing that, we will also discuss his views on categorical imperative, that is a kind of a priori maxim in Kant which enables the individual to decide for themselves what would be the moral code or the moral laws that should be binding on their practical activities. So, first part of the lecture today we will discuss his views on categorical imperative and its contrast with hypothetical imperative, and in the second part we will discuss how he combines his views on morality with freedom, autonomy and rationality. So, in Kant we have a kind of very distinct concept of morality which he combines with the freedom and autonomy of the individual. So, being moral is not something to be guided by a code of law which is set by others in the society. This kind of morality is something which individual as a moral agent, as a free and autonomous agent set for themselves. So, that is a very distinct conception of morality that we have in Kant, which is very distinct from say ordinary sense of morality, that is you go by the prevalent norms and codes in the society that would not lead to enlightenment. As we have discussed in the previous lecture, the individual must be capable of deciding for themselves what should be the guiding force of their life, what should guide their practical action. So, the basis for such decision is human reason and rationality. So, human being A should be capable of reasoning or thinking for themselves, and B they should also have the courage to follow what they think is right, not what others think for themselves. So that would be the condition of immaturity, that would be the condition of dependence, and that would not lead to enlightenment, either at the individual level or at the societal level or at the community level. So in Kant we have a very unique conception of morality and also the notion of freedom and autonomy. So individual, as we have discussed, is a rational or moral agent, and the basis of such morality is not like ordinary sense of the religion or the established social norms that should guide human behavior or human activities, but human reason and rationality. So it's a kind of very beautiful, eloquent combination of reason, rationality with the morality, and within the limits of morality then human being realize or actualize his own self. That's the whole purpose of enlightenment tradition in Europe. So this, the moral codes are based on free and autonomous goodwill of the individual. So there is a kind of inherent assertion of goodwill in the human being, and how human being lead his life according to that goodwill, which would be a kind of transcendence from their actual particular circumstances of life to the universal being. So individual through his goodwill or through his notion of morality can see in himself the universal man. So that the kingdom of end or the perpetual peace, which we would discuss in the next lecture, is based on this very distinct sense of human being as a rational moral agent endowed with goodwill, and it is acting according to the goodwill that individual in the particular circumstances become the universal man or part of the universal community. So reason and rationality according to Kant is the only source of all knowledge. It allows individual to self legislate. That's the another characteristic of Kantian morality or sense of duty, that no external body, either society or person or a group of body, tells the individual what to do. It is the individual themselves, by using their own reason and rationality, decide what they should do. In deciding that, they should guide their action on the basis of a priori maxim, which he calls categorical imperative. So the reason and rationality allows the individual to self legislate their duty towards their own self and others in the community. So with the use of reason, we not only decide or think for our own self, but also our obligation and duty towards others in the society. And the kingdom of ends, and the idea of the kingdom of ends, is that kind of society where everyone would treat everyone else as an end in themselves, thereby acknowledging and respecting the dignity of all. And that kind of society would be a society which would be peaceful, harmonious society. So this reason and rationality allows the individual to self legislate their duty towards self and others, and this they will do when they are free and autonomous. So the other condition of deciding for oneself is that individual is free, not under any form of subjugation to other men or society or any other authority. So individual is free and autonomous, and then using their own reason, they decide the codes of morality that govern their action towards themselves and also towards other in the society. So to explain this interconnection between the free and autonomous will of the individual with morality, Kant provides a kind of a priori maxim. We will discuss what this a priori means, that is, prior to any human experience or consideration of any empirical context. It is a kind of abstract idea, a priori, prior to everything else. So the moral codes and the morality requires that principle which would be free from, in isolation of any given practical empirical situation in which human being act, behave and lives. So, he explained this interconnection between morality, freedom and autonomy through a maxim which is a priori maxim, which he calls categorical imperative. Henceforth, we will refer to it as CI. So, we will discuss what this categorical imperative is. So, this categorical imperative is for human being or the individual who is rational, a kind of practical reasoning. So, in the given practical context, what course of action one should follow? To decide that, one needs to understand or guide one's action according to this categorical imperative, which is the source of morality, virtue and happiness for the human being. So, according to Kant, an individual's actions and practical reason should be guided by this imperative alone. So, this is merely a maxim, an imperative through which human beings legislate for themselves what course of action they should follow. It does not really tell them do this or do that. It just gives them a framework. By using them, they decide for themselves what is the best possible action they should follow in a particular given circumstances. And to do that, they have to apply a reason and see themselves as part of universal self, whether there is a kind of intelligibility by the others. So, they should act upon those principles which they want others also to follow in the given context. So, that is the categorical imperative which we will discuss, that is based on the practical reason or the practical circumstances of human life, and yet it is part of universal. So, there is a kind of paradox. You develop your codes of morality in a particular context, and yet you act on the principle which you want to be universal. That means others should be also following the same course of action in the given context. So, there is a kind of this paradox of being particular and at the same time universal. He explained this position on morality, autonomy and freedom in this work, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Moral, which we will refer to as groundwork in this lecture today. Now, let us discuss why do we need moral philosophy, what is its aims and objectives. So, if you look at the very objective of any philosophy, whether it is the political philosophy or moral philosophy, they aims to provide a kind of society or a condition or a set of norms that would enable the individual to lead a good life. And definition of good life will vary, but all human beings want to live a good, dignified and happy life. Now, how to lead that life? In what kind of society that life is possible? What kind of state structure should be there? These are some of the reflections that we have seen from the classical Greek times in Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and now Kant and many other thinkers that is there in the course. They are all engaged in answering this question, that in which kind of society individual life would be more dignified, more equal, more just and happy. So, the primary objective of philosophy is to provide us a set of moral laws or principles that will enable us to lead a good, happy and dignified life. So, all human beings across the context universally want to lead a life which would be good, happy and dignified. The search for those principles or norms to lead a life of eudaimania, if you remember our first few lectures on Greek philosopher, was there in the Greek philosophers writings such as Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And particularly if you focus and recall our lecture on Aristotle and his views on judgment, you will know that how he was also searching for a code of law, so did Plato and Socrates and other thinkers that we have discussed in this course so far. They all search for those codes or the principles which would enable the human being to lead a life which would be the life of eudaimania or a happy life dignified life. So, particularly if you look at Aristotle's writings on ethics, he combines the general and the universal concept of ethics in contrast to Platonic. There is a kind of absolute knowledge or absolute forms of ethics or morality in Plato. In contrast to that, in Aristotle we find a kind of combination of the universal or the abstract notion of ethics with the practical context of the community. And it is the combination of the universal with the particular that human beings developed correct political judgment. So, in Aristotle we have this combination of general and universal concept of ethics with the practical context of human life and the community. And according to Aristotle, human beings develop the ability to correct judgment. Judgment is something that guides our action. We subject our life to our judgment and then realize the potentialities or the full potentialities of our life dependent on the correct judgment. And the correct judgment requires first the understanding of the general or the universal code of ethics and also the practical context of human life or community. So, according to Aristotle, human beings develop the ability to correct judgment by living among the free and equal members. So, life in the polis or life in the city state or the public life is the best life that enables the individual to realize his true potentialities. That is by living among the others who are equal and free in the community. So, the correct judgment according to Aristotle is the outcome of associational life of individual with others who are free and equal in the community. Kant in modern times provides us a more comprehensive and thorough account of universal morality, and also that morality should be guided by the practical reason. So, the Kantian categorical imperative guides the practical reason, how individuals should act in a practical given context. So, the moral laws in Kant's philosophy have transcendental characteristic, and this transcendental characteristic in Kantian morality is that even when they act in their particular context, they transcend it to act in the principle which they want at the same time to become universal. That means the other person, without any consideration to the context, should act according to the same principle which that particular person follow in that particular context. So, there is a kind of transcendental ethics or transcendental characteristic of Kantian morality. Now, let us discuss this question: why do we need morality and why moral codes applies to the human being or the human species? So, the reason for that is that we are moral agent. And what does it mean to be a moral agent? It means that we have a sense of justice or a sense of discretion which tells us what is good or what is bad, what is desirable or what is undesirable. So, there is a kind of intuitive, innate sense, and this is there in the social contract tradition thinkers as well. Even in the state of nature where there is no society, no association, and yet human beings have a sense of morality or a sense of justness. And this, if you recall Aristotle again, that human beings are not God nor beast. So, unlike God, they do not know everything, or unlike beast, it is also not true that they do not know anything. So, we know something, but there are the domains of life which we do not know. So, human beings have a peculiar situation of existence where they have a sense, but they are also prone to making a lot of immoral acts or undesirable behavior. Whole moral philosophy tries to provide us a set of norms which would make human life more perfect, enable it to lead a more virtuous life, more happy life, and to lead that human beings then have to learn or develop for themselves what is good, what is desirable, what is moral for them to do, and the source of such morality or desire is not based on religion or any other things in enlightenment thought, but on human reason itself. So, the codes of morality then therefore applies only to the human being, not to the beast or other species on the earth. They are driven by their desire or passion alone. It is the human being who have the capacity to reason, and this is the capacity to reason that tells them the distinction between actions or behaviors that is morally justified and actions and behavior that is morally unjustified. So, they have this intuitive sense of morality and ethics, and therefore, the moral laws and moral codes are applicable to the human being. So, human being is then not just a rational being who constantly try to actualize himself in isolation of society or in or from the society or community. Individual as a rational agent or a rational being is also a moral agent, having a sense of good and bad, desirable or undesirable, just and unjust, and therefore human being could not avoid the moral questions and dilemmas that we face in our practical everyday life. So, the question that we face every day is the moral dilemmas, and moral philosophy tells us how to overcome those dilemmas, how to perfect our action according to the moral codes, and what should be the source of that moral code. So, the question is, what should be the codes of morality that would guide our practical life? What should be its source? So, for a very long time religion or religious treatises used to provide that set of codes through which human being perfect or correct their behavior or actions in the society towards themselves, towards their family, towards the society, towards the state. A lot of moral codes was enshrined in the religious text. But with the enlightenment, you have a new modes of thinking where human beings for themselves, regarded as a rational agent, would decide for themselves what is moral code or what is the sense of duty towards which they have the obligation. So, as we have discussed in the theory of political obligation with the social contract traditions, that human beings themselves consent to a particular form of authority, and then the moral obligation or the political obligation they have is based on their consent, and it not on any divine right theory or any religious prescription. They obey certain commands or certain rules and certain forms of authority. So, the question with the moral philosophy is the what should be the codes of morality that should guide the practical life, what should be its source, and who should formulate it. It is the society, community, or the religious text, or the preachers, or the individual themselves. In the Kant, we see that he formulate a notion of morality where individual as a free and autonomous being decide for themselves, legislate for themselves what is the duty or what is their sense of morality to which they should subject their life and perfect their life in a way. So, in the groundwork, Kant provides a kind of deontological and categorical account of our fundamental moral obligation or duty towards the self and others in the society, and moral philosophy seeks to identify and realize the ultimate end or the highest good possible to accomplish by human beings. And human beings, as you know in many other writings, have the capability to behave like a beast and also to perfect his or her life, to lead a dignified life or a respected life by following certain codes of morality that they themselves legislate using their own reason, and then constantly tries to perfect their lives. Let's think of it in this way. Human beings are also sensuous beings. They have their desire and passion, and those desire and passion may not necessarily lead to moral behavior or moral action, and yet human beings has innate search for something ultimate, something that is permanent, something that is the source of ultimate peace or satisfaction. In Kant you have the response that human beings, when he or she uses his own reason or rational faculty, only then he is capable to guide his life and his relationship with others according to a moral laws that will give them a sense of obligation or a sense of duty to which they must perform their actions or subject their action to rational basis, which would enable the human being to realize his true or the highest possible potentialities in life. So it requires moral virtue with complete happiness. So we will discuss, when we will discuss this categorical imperative and hypothetical imperative. That means some actions may give us immediate satisfaction, but in the long term it has devastating consequences. But there are certain codes which leads us to behave and act in a manner which would have a kind of permanent peaceful consequences or enable the condition of life which would be everlastingly happy, or a kind of perpetual peace, a kind of constant happiness possible when we try to lead a life of happiness by combining it with virtue. And there is then combination of then human reason and rationality, and reason and rationality in itself is not sufficient. It must subject itself to a set of codes or morality which individuals themselves then legislate or define. So thus moral philosophy sets out to first identify what is goodwill, obligation, duty towards the self and others. Now we will look at particularly how Kant defines morality, or what should be the source of morality in individual everyday practical situation or circumstances, by understanding his views on categorical or hypothetical imperative. So Kant's conception of morality, as we have discussed, is a kind of a priori maxim which he calls categorical imperative. It is a priori in the sense that it is based on a kind of abstract principle that does not take into account or consideration the actual context of human existence or human being. So this imperative in Kant is based on abstract principle that does not take into account any consideration of the actual circumstances in which human being lives. It is imperative in the sense that it is a command, a kind of order which is compulsory for the human being to follow. So it obliges the rational and moral agent to behave and act in a particular manner. So it is a priori, it is imperative that it forces or obliges the individual to act or behave in a particular manner in a particular circumstances, and it is categorical in the sense that it must be compulsorily, universally and unconditionally followed. So that is the defining characteristic of a categorical imperative, that is, it is binding, it is compulsory, and it should be followed universally and unconditionally. There should not be any condition to follow the categorical imperative or the rules that is based on categorical imperative. So as an imperative, it does not tell the individual exactly what to do in a given context. So unlike any other commands or order which is very specific, shut the door, open the window, close the window, switch on the light. So these are the command which is very specific, exactly tells other individual what to do. In contrast to that, categorical imperative is not something which is precise or exactly telling the individual what to do. It is basically a maxim, a kind of framework, a kind of principle using which individual as a rational moral agent will arrive at a particular action which they want others to follow universally and unconditionally. So there is a kind of complex argument there in the categorical imperative, which is also universal and unconditional. So instead, as an abstract maxim, as I said, it does not take into account any particular empirical circumstances of human living. It provides them with a formula to choose a particular course of action in a particular given context which they want others to follow in the same context without exception. Now let us discuss this idea. Say telling lies is not acceptable or morally acceptable at least, and yet we tend to speak lies if it is beneficial to us. Now how we will arrive at a moral code that would be applied universally without any exception to us and also to others, and that is the whole idea of kingdom of ends in a way. So it would be possible to argue that we speak lies if it is beneficial to us, but then we do not want others to speak lies, and that leads to conflicts. So to avoid those conflicts and contradictions, the moral code that individual as a rational being should arrive at is based on the maxim that she wants others also to follow the same course of action which he or she is following in a particular given circumstances universally and unconditionally. That means, let us take the other example. So in the exam you want to cheat or copy from others to secure more marks, but at the same time you do not want others to cheat or copy from others to get the more marks. So there is a kind of moral contradictions here, but categorical imperative tells you to follow only those course of action which you want others to follow in that same circumstances universally and unconditionally. That means then speaking truth is better, treating others as an end in themselves is better, not cheating in the exam is better. That applies to you and you want it to be applied universally to others as well. So that is the whole basis of categorical imperative in a sense. So thus the characteristic of categorical imperative is its abstractness. It is not specific to any particular circumstances and yet it guides practical action. So it is abstract, it is general, universal and unconditional. So you subject your action, your practical activities to this reason without any condition. It wants the individual to act according to those principles through which you want others to guide their actions in a similar context universally and unconditionally. So that is the whole point of categorical imperative, that the moral code that you arrive at is specific to a particular context and yet it has universal application. So the legislation of moral code that is done by individual in a particular situation has its universal application at the same time. So there is a kind of this transcending the particular context to the universal community of individual. So thus categorical imperative according to Kant is not a moral law in itself. So in itself categorical imperative, as we have explained, is not telling the individual what to do in a particular context, but how they ought to do as a moral rational agent, that is acting according to the principle which you want others to follow in the same context universally across the context and unconditionally. So that is a kind of formula, that is a kind of maxim, but in itself it does not tell the individual what to do and what not to do. Individuals themselves decide what they should do on the condition that they want others to follow it also. In the the moral conflicts in life is, in economics we use the term free rider. We should pay the tax, but what if out of millions or billions 1 or 10% do not pay tax? It will not affect overall, but then if suppose in the millions 90% or 50% of the people will start thinking that in the similar way the free rider, what if rest of them should pay and I am not paying, so I will be the beneficiary of not paying the tax, but that 50-60% will create a devastating influence on the revenue of the government. Similarly, in terms of voting, you should vote for electing your representative, but many voters think, what if I do not vote? Would it make any large difference? But if say 40-30% of enlightened or rational citizen refrain from voting, then you get the representative which you do not like most of the time. So, this is a kind of guide to the practical condition by following this categorical imperative, which should not be contradictory within. It has to be morally consistent. That means you subject your practical activities on the principle which you want others to follow as well. You do not make exception for yourself or others while subjecting your practical action to a set of moral codes or a sense of obligation. So, categorical imperative in itself is not a moral law. It only provides the framework through which individual as a rational agent develop for themselves what is their duty or an obligation to self and others. It is a maxim that enables free and autonomous moral agent to use it as the basis to guide their practical actions. So, categorical imperative is not like utilitarianism as a philosophy that only those policies should be followed by the government which would be in the benefit of the maximum number of people. So, in that sense, the categorical imperative is not a kind of consequentialist argument that the success of a policy or a rule is based on the consequences. The moral law should be just in itself. It does not require any further justification or justification on the basis of the consequences. So, in the Kantian ethics, what you have is, once you decide for yourself what is your duty, you ought to perform it without any consideration of its consequences. That is the moral law. That is how you lead a dignified life and how it is possible to lead a happy life which would be peaceful or ever free from violence, conflicts and enviness. So, one has to follow categorical imperative regardless of the consequences, inclinations and feelings. So, all the feelings, inclinations and the consequences should be subjected to human reason and moral sense of duty. So, it helps the moral agent develop a sense of duty which she must perform or he must perform. This sense of duty among the free moral agent is based on the moral laws within and not from outside. So, thus Kant provide a kind of deontological, that is a science of morality, duty or ethics foundation for the categorical imperative. So, there is no consequentialist justification for this imperative. Human being as a moral and rational agent remain free and autonomous by following laws legislated by themselves using this a priori maxim categorical imperative. And this he makes the argument of freedom similar to Rousseau, that by following the general will you will be free, and if you do not want to follow the general will you will be forced to follow it, and thereby individual can be forced to be free in a sense. So, therefore, categorical imperative is to be followed by everyone universally and unconditionally, and this categorical imperative we can better understand by contrasting it with the hypothetical imperative. So, ethics and morality based on categorical imperative enables individuals to live a virtuous and happy life. So, remember the Greek philosophers, that what kind of life is a happy life? That kind of life is happy which is virtuous life. And what is virtue? Knowledge is virtue. And how you pursue knowledge? It is through reason. So, there is a kind of similar argument here in a way, but in a more complex manner, where you subject your reason to a set of codes or morality which you decide for yourself. So, to lead a happy life, one has to be virtuous. Without virtue, happiness or happy life is impossible to have, or even if you have it, it would not be permanent. So, to lead a kind of permanent happy life, one need to be virtuous, and to be virtuous one has to be moral, and that moral law then limits the reason and rationality, which otherwise lead to chaos or undesirable consequences for individual or also for the community. So, it is so as the codes of moral norms that guide their practical actions are based on categorical imperative, which they themselves legislate, and these laws and codes are good in itself. It does not require any further external justification. So, using the categorical imperative on the basis of your reason and rationality, you arrive at a sense of duty or a sense of obligation which is good in itself regardless of its consequences. So, you ought to perform it without any consideration of its consequences. Now, let us contrast it with the hypothetical imperative, that is based on certain predetermined goals and objectives, and that is you see in the practical life most of the time. Human beings being rational, they first set certain goals and objectives, and then they guide their actions in a manner which help them to achieve those goals and objectives. So, that is the hypothetical imperative, very opposite of categorical imperative. In the hypothetical imperative, you already set certain goals and objectives and choose that course of action which helps you achieve those goals and objectives. So, in this sense, hypothetical imperative is conditional, not unconditional like categorical imperative. That is, the success of any course of action or failures of that action is based on the consequences of it. That is, whether that action help the individual to achieve or not to achieve the pre-desired goals and objectives. So, the hypothetical imperative would be conditional on the consequences of certain course of action. So, as a rational agent, using rationality and reason in the instrumental sense to achieve certain purpose which you decide beforehand, and then a particular course of action is good or bad, successful or a failure, depending upon whether it helps you to achieve that desire or pre-decided goals and objectives or not. So, that is the hypothetical imperative, and categorical imperative is very opposite of that. That means, you set a set of objectives or a sense of duty which is good in itself. It does not require any further justification or any consideration of the consequences, and it is in a sense of truth, beauty, life, happiness, dignity and so on. It does not depend on the consequences of your action, but the law that you follow is good in itself regardless of the consequences. Hypothetical imperative is very different, that is dependent on the consequences. So, one of the philosophy that we have discussed, utilitarian philosophy, is the best example of hypothetical imperative, that is that course of law and public policies would be follow which would be in the maximum benefit of maximum number. So, it depends, and the justification for that course of action is the consequences of that action. So, the external objects or consequences of one's actions are the legitimizing ground for hypothetical imperative. So, whether a course of action is right or wrong depends on its ability to achieve certain pre-decided goals and objectives. According to Kant, hypothetical imperative may lead to conflicts and enviousness among the people, because suppose if, as I have given the example of free rider, while paying the tax or while going for voting, it may create conflicts, it may create enviousness in the society, whereas categorical imperative would create a condition or create a society where everyone would follow a code of law which would be just in itself. It would be applicable to everyone in the similar context unconditionally and universally, and that would be a society of perpetual peace without violence, conflict or enviousness among its inhabitants. So, hypothetical imperative then could not lead to permanent peace or happiness either for the individual or for the society. So, as an individual using your hypothetical imperative or using your reason, you may get some instant satisfaction, but it may not give you permanent satisfaction or permanent happiness. You may repent later, or you may develop a sense of guilt. While doing it, you may have certain satisfaction, but then after doing it, you develop some sense of guilt. So, there is a kind of innate moral sense of just and unjustness in human being, and human being must subject reason, rationality, practical actions, behavior, desire and passion to a certain code of duty and obligation to self and others, and that they can do on the basis of categorical imperative, not on hypothetical imperative. So, according to Kant, categorical imperative being good in itself and free from the condition, it is not on the basis of any conditionalities, could lead to lasting peace and happiness within the self and also among others in the society or community. Now, we look at how he combines freedom, morality and autonomy together. So, for Kant, the goal of human actions is the attainment or realization of maximum freedom or autonomy. So, all our life individual want to maximize his freedom, maximize his autonomy. That means freedom from the external interference and control by others. However, such freedom or autonomy for the individual is possible by following the moral laws that they themselves legislate. Thus, they are free from external control and interference, and in the groundwork, Kant described the notion of free will and relate it to the idea of autonomy, rationality and morality. He writes, freedom will be identical with autonomy, and since autonomy is the principle of morality, a free will would be a will under moral laws. So, the free will is not free from all kind of restraints. It must be subjected to a set of moral laws which individuals themselves legislate by using their own free will and autonomy. So, for Kant, freedom is a necessary presupposition of all activities as well as all forms of thinking. So, you cannot have enlightenment unless individuals are free to think or free to choose a particular course of action. So, a rational agent must regard himself or herself as capable of thinking on his own rational principles, and only so can she regard his her will as his her own. So, most of us really live our life by following the norms and the values set by others. Kant was envisaging a society or a community where individual will think for themselves as a free autonomous subject, and while doing so they will subject themselves to a set of moral laws which they themselves legislate, and not the society, not the community and not any other body. So, this free will is good in itself without further qualifications. So, once you have that goodwill, you develop that goodwill using your sense of obligation, duty by following categorical imperative or using the reason, that would be good in itself. It does not require the consequences or the outcome of your actions. So, this will is conceived as a power of determining oneself to act in accordance with the idea of certain moral and ethical laws, and emphasizing upon rationality, Kant maintains that only a rational being has the power to act in accordance with his idea of laws, that is in accordance with the principles, and only so has he a will. So having a will requires individual to act according to one's own thinking and considering himself as free from any kind of external control and interference. So free will starts with the thinking first, as free from any kind of subjugation by the society or by other external authority. So then Kant explains that freedom and autonomy can be realized only in the kingdom of ends, which we will discuss in the next class. And in this kingdom of ends, we treat our own person and others as an end in themselves and not as a means for our further ends. So a will operating on the principle would be free from any ground determination in nature and hence truly free. A moral subject is thus autonomous in a radical sense. He obeys the dictates of his own free will using his own reason. So there is a kind of very sophisticated argument in Kant by combining both the freedom and autonomy by subjecting the both to the moral codes or a sense of moral duty and obligation in the human being using his idea of categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative, Kant suggests, gives subjective reality to human freedom. So this really does not give the individual a moral code. Using it, individual can themselves decide for what they should do in a particular given circumstances or in the practical life. It instructs us as how we ought to act to confirm our autonomy. So the laws or the sense of moral duty and obligation is given to us not by any other body but by ourselves, by using our own reason and rational faculty and subjecting it to the moral code and obligation that we decide for themselves. So there is a kind of you are free and autonomous, and yet that freedom and autonomy is realized by following certain moral codes which you yourself have legislated. So no matter what the actual circumstances of man are, he ought to act in a manner that reflects his own dignity and worth as a moral and rational being. So as an end in himself, man is only bound by those laws which he himself enacts, and this has the wider acceptance also. So in modern democracy, you see we govern by laws and legislation. And what is the basis of that laws and legislation? That is, it is formulated by the representative which we ourselves have elected. So for instance, in the parliament, laws are formulated or policies are formulated. The other organs of the state such as executive or the judiciary help us in the implementation or correct implementation of those laws and policies that is formulated by the parliament. And the parliament is the will of the people, and therefore the laws and legislation enacted by the parliament has the legitimacy, reflects the will of the people, and we must subject ourselves to those laws and legislation. However, here in Kantian ethics, it is not a kind of representative or a kind of delegation of this legislation. Categorical imperative does not envisage such a representation and delegation of legislative activity. It is like all individual as a free autonomous subject who are rational must legislate for himself what is good and what code of actions they should follow in their practical life. So for Kant, rationality involves thinking in universal terms while acting in a particular context and thinking consistently. Hence the maxim underlying any proposed action must be such that we can universalize without contradiction. So Cia is the source of moral action for the man with a good will, that is, as a rational agent, he guides his practical life by an absolute and compulsorily binding sense of duty or obligation, and in doing so an individual in his or her particular context simultaneously act as a member of the universal community, and that is the kind of paradox which Kant transcends. So, you are acting in a particular context, but acting in a manner which you want to be universal. That means you want other men to follow in the similar context, and thereby they make themselves known to the intelligible world. So, there is a kind of transcendental notion of freedom in Kant's philosophy, and he argued that before acting upon our free autonomous good or moral will, we must intuitively think ourselves as free. So, this intuitive thinking of being free from any external restraints and controls is necessary for individual to act in an enlightened manner, to subject themselves and their actions to a particular set of codes or moral codes or a sense of duty and obligation, and this they must perform towards themselves and also towards others in the society. So, first requirement is you must intuitively think yourself as free from any external restraints and controls. So, categorical imperative is the basis of all forms of social and moral living according to Kant, and it is the basis of organizing individual and collective lives on the rational laws and free will of the individual. So, the moral sense of duty in Kant is equal to legality, that is, it is compulsory, it is binding on the individual like laws, and categorical imperative command absolute obedience, which is independent of an individual's empirical context. So, it helps them to distinguish his free, reason governed, autonomous nature from the unfree and passive nature of the animal. Thus, there appears to be a kind of paradox in Kantian notion of freedom. On the one hand, he argues about the empirical or the practical context of human being, which is bound by the laws of causality. However, as a moral being, he imagines him or her to transcend those contexts and act as a universal being guided by categorical imperative based on reason. So, there is a kind of transcendental logic or sense of ethics and morality here. Hence, it is argued that Kant's conception of freedom and autonomy is more like Rousseau's idea of general will as the source of human freedom. So, he is taking a lot of inspiration from Rousseau's conception of general will, and the idea of self legislation, and the basis of legitimacy is the based on the direct and the active participation of its citizen in making the laws. So, similar to Rousseau's ideas on freedom, Kant argued that human beings could realize his true worth by following their self legislated moral laws, that is based on categorical imperative. So, that is all in this lecture today, and for the themes that we have covered in this lecture today, you can refer to some of these texts like Gary Browning, A History of Modern Political Thought, Paul Goyer, The Cambridge Companion to Kant and Modern Philosophy, Otfried Hoff, Immanuel Kant, and from Kant you can read this What is Enlightenment, and also certainly this text, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Most of the discussion is based on this text. Hans Rees, you can also refer to Kant Political Writings, and Roger Scruton, Kant A Very Short Introduction. So, these are some of the texts you should refer to understand more on Kant's categorical imperative, how he differentiates it with the hypothetical imperative, and also how he combines morality with freedom and autonomy. So, that is all in this lecture today. Thanks for your patience and thanks for listening. Do share your comment and feedbacks, we will be happy to respond. Thank you all.